So Rava says, it's a Gemara in Tainus. Rava says, I've learned enormous amount of knowledge from my teachers. From my colleagues, even more than my teachers. And from my students, more than any of them. As a student, you know very little. You attend a class or a subject to be taught because you're not well versed in that subject. So you learn enormous amount of knowledge from that teacher. From my peers, more than my teachers. Because when you learn from a peer, you're both on the same level. You have the ability to understand. And now, and as much as we ourselves believe our position may be cogent and correct, but because we have our own conflicts of interest, we don't see the inconsistencies which may exist, but a third party could see it. So when you enter into a dialogue with two people who are interested in coming to truth, then you're able to come to a level of understanding what's right or what's wrong. The Talmud tells us, cites a verse, there in Hebrew, the word makel means a staff, a makel. And it says there were a group of people, they were called maklos, staves. And there were another group of people, they were called noam. Noam is pleasantness. So the Gemara tells us that Talmidei Chacham shebeBavel, the Torah sages, scholars who were in Babylon, they were called, referred to, classified as maklos, as staves. Why? Shecholfin zeh ba'alocha, because when they would enter into a dialogue in halacha or Torah discussion, they were like in a fray. It was like a battle. It was fight to the finish. But Talmidei Chacham shebe'Eretz Yisrael, but the Talmidei Chacham, the Torah sages in Eretz Yisrael, they're called noam, pleasantness. Why? Shamanim zeh ba'alocha. They would put their minds together, and together they would try to come to a clarity, and they would, because each one paid attention and fully valued what the other one is saying. The Babylonians, Torah sages, the main emphasis was, it's the me and the I. So I'm proving that you're wrong, so I'm right. So therefore it's a battle. It's a battle for the victory. But in Eretz Yisrael, they call noam, pleasantness. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Maybe you have some input. Maybe I missed the point. It's really what we're speaking over here, Bikom Lam de Hiskalti. I can always learn. Maybe as much as I think I understand what it is, maybe you have something to offer, and maybe I missed the point. And by hearing what you said, I will understand what I said may not be exactly correct, or what you say may add to what I say. Magnify it, enhance it, advance it, whatever it may be. So therefore, the Talmidei Chacham Eretz Yisrael, they were called Noam. Bavel, they were called Maklos. They were like staves, sticks. They were fighting one another till they finally came, whatever that conclusion was. Were they less humble? What do we attribute it to? It was a lack of humility. Gemara tells over a story of Rabbi Yochanan, who was the leading sage in Israel at his time. He had a student, and the student's name is mentioned many times in the Talmud. His name was Ula. Ula was his name. Ula was the student of Rabbi Yochanan. And Ula was traveling back from Babylon with two Jews who came from a community called Mechuzah. Mechuzah was a city, one of the municipalities of Babylon in Iraq. And they're traveling, and they get into an argument, these two Jews from this community called Mechuzah. One takes out a knife and slits the other one's throat, kills him, becomes enraged, cuts his throat. So he says to Ula, who's a great rabbi, he says, did I do a good job? So Ula was afraid if he doesn't say the right thing, he may do the same to him. So he says, maybe cut a little bit more. Didn't cut sufficiently. But after he said that to him, he realized he may have contributed to the man's death by saying that. So it weighed very heavily on him. So he's traveling back. Finally, he arrives in Yerushalayim, and he goes to his Rebbe Yochanan, and he tells him the story. He tells him these two Jews, they got into an argument. One became enraged at the other, took out a knife and killed him. And he asked me, did I do a good job? And I said, cut a little more. I said, I may have contributed to the man's death. Rebbe says, you don't have to worry. When he cut his throat, the man was equivalent of he killed him already. Cutting more or less doesn't mean anything. Therefore, you don't have to be worried or be concerned about this. But he says, one question I have, how could Jews be so enraged, reach a point of rage that one Jew could kill another Jew? How is it possible? So Ula says to his Rebbe, it happened before we crossed the Jordan. Because it tells us in the Tochacha, in the curse in the Torah, the Shom Nosatilchod Levragos. There, when you go into exile to Babylon, you're going to have an enraged heart. You're going to have an agitated heart. You're always going to be in an agitated emotional state. So being in that agitated emotional state, although a person has to take control of his life, but therefore it's within understanding why there's such a thing could happen. Because we didn't yet cross the Jordan, we were still out of Israel. He says, oh, now I understand why this could happen. So in Bavel, what is the key to come upon understanding? Focus. Even though we believe we're focused, but there's so many undercurrents in our minds, which are distractions, and therefore we're not fully focused. You know, the power of concentration is very valuable. You read something, you think you're focused, but the other people, when they read something, even if somebody would speak, they wouldn't hear that person speaking because they're so immersed in what they're reading. That's that degree of focus. So therefore, a person may believe he's at one level, but simultaneously there's so many things, there's so much internal turmoil goes on within a person's emotion, and that doesn't allow him to fully grasp it and see it clearly. There's this agitation. That's part of being in exile, being outside of Israel. Therefore, the Babylonian Torah sages, being in that, the Gemara refers to it as Ara Chashucha, it's a darkened land. The Gemara says, because it's a darkened land, their level of clarity is also darkened. They don't have the clarity of the Torah scholars in Israel. Again, but why not? It's because it's all attributed to this agitation. Because if you're agitated, yet internally you have this emotional turmoil and this level of interference, you're not able to come upon and fully focus sufficiently to come to that. Therefore, they had to literally battle it out. But what we're speaking about here in the Mishnah, but if you could learn from him, why don't you? Because you've already passed judgment. If I am I and he is he, what could he teach me? That has to do with humility. That's humility. If you listen, there's no takeaways, but you never know. If wisdom is the ultimate, and he may have what to offer, why don't you listen? Because what could he offer? But how do you pass judgment so quickly? The answer is, it's your ego. So again, David HaMelech, King David, who was the third most humble person who ever lived, he says, Mikom Lamdei Skalti. He never passed an opportunity to learn from anyone. As I always say, the Gemara says, Talmud says, you can learn modesty from a cat. That when it does, it relieves itself, it does it in a very private place. You can learn alacrity, zeal from an ant. It's a verse in Proverbs, in Mishlei. Lazy one, go to the ant and learn from its ways. It has no one who compels it. Look, it's industrious. Doesn't waste a moment. There's all these takeaways. Once mentioned, my mashgiach, blessed memory, once used to ask, you learn different things from different species. But factually, that's only because the way the DNA, they're controlled by what? Everything's instinctive behavior. They have no control. An ant behaves industriously with zeal because that's the way God created the ant. And the cat has the characteristic of modesty. And each animal, we read in Pirkei Avos at the end, towards the later chapters, you should be gibor kari, be strong as a lion, be as fierce as a leopard. You should be swift as an eagle. We're not an eagle, we're not a lion, we're not a leopard. So how could you be as swift? How could you be as powerful? We're this, frail, limited human being. We don't have the power of any of these species. So again, firstly, what does it mean? Be as powerful as a lion. But we should take, that's a takeaway. But you want to tell me gibor means take control of your life, fine. But that has nothing to do with a lion. So what does it mean? You have a certain innate commonality with the lion. What's the basis even to consider that? A lion, an eagle, a deer, any of these species. So there's an Avos Reb Nosson, which is equivalent to Pirkei Avos, writes that a human being is referred to as olam katan. A human being is a microcosm of all existence. As we discussed, the Mishkan is a microcosm of creation. The human being is a microcosm of the whole world, including all its species. So therefore, the characteristic of the lion is within the human being. The leopard, the eagle, the deer, every one of those characteristics are inborn in a human being. It's like, you have a piece of rough, a diamond, and you cut it, then you bring it out, you're able to see what that diamond is, how many carats, the clarity, whatever it may be, and its brilliance. Every human being has some degree of that within him. You have to hone it, you have to develop it. Knowing that, we're able to draw on that power. A person can be fierce, we can be strong. It's impossible. How am I supposed to do it? There's no such thing as impossible. I mean, certain things are impossible. A human being can't lift a mountain. But as we always say, if there's a will, there's a way. That if a person is determined, even a person of average intelligence, he applies himself, he seeks out various solutions and advice. And ultimately, even though he himself cannot bring about the result, but through that initiative and desire to bring about a certain result, he's able to. Cited, the early commentators right, we speak about chesed. Not everybody has the means to do chesed, acts of loving kindness. But what about if you could raise money to impress upon other people, the value of this cause or this person's needs, and you're credible to them? You're actually the one who's bringing that charity to that person. And not only bring charity to the person, you bring merit to the one who now is assisting that person. So you have a double value. The reason why the person is going to gain is because you had spoken to that third party. And the reason why that third party acted charitably is because you impressed upon him the need of that person. And it's the same thing. We're talking about determination, initiative, and that's gvura, that's power. You don't, as we say, you don't leave a stone unturned, ever. And just keep going. I'd mentioned that within the spiritual realm, there's a concept known as whatever path a person wants to walk, whatever path you want to take, God will lead you on that path. You want to walk a path of tzaddik, God will bring you every opportunity to be that tzaddik. You want to walk a path to be evil, God will present every opportunity. Of course, it's your choice, that it should be available for you to make those kinds of choices. So it's part of the system. If a person is determined to do certain things, negative or positive, God will provide the context to be able to exercise and actualize that intent or that will. So when we say this, if there's a will, is a way, of course. I want to be a millionaire. If you're determined, it's going to happen. It may not happen. It probably won't happen. But in terms of bringing about results In areas which pertain to doing good things or bad things, there we see it happening. You know? So we speak about Bikom Lam de Hiskalti. There's no one I can't learn from. Remember, when I went to yeshiva, was there a few years. I must have been, at the time, maybe 15. I was still in high school. And one of my teachers, he'd graduated Rutgers. He and his wife were both Bali Tshuva. And he was going to Maryland Law School at the time. But in the afternoon, he taught in the yeshiva. He taught history. He was the history teacher. And he was about Tshuva, didn't know very much. Rabbi Riff, there was a Rabbi Riff who was the chief rabbi of Camden, New Jersey, like Rabbi Teitz. His area was Elizabeth, New Jersey. All the rabbis were under his auspices. So in Camden, there were many Jews, we're talking about the early part of the 20th century, passed away in the 60s. And he was a grandson of Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv. His mother was a daughter of the Netziv. So he was very special. And he was a colleague of Moshe Feinstein. And this person was Rabbi Riff's Bal Tshuva. He had brought both he and his wife to become observant, but they didn't know very much. The man that time must have been about 30 years old. He wanted to study. So he went to the equivalent of the principal of the high school and said, he'd like to enroll. He'd like to attend class. So he sat in class with 14-year-old boys trying to understand beginner's Talmud. You know what that means? The man already graduated. He was in law school, and he may have had a graduate degree in something else. And he's sitting with these 14-year-old children or 13-year-old boys learning the fundamentals, how to understand a piece of Gemara. That takes quite a bit. That means you have to ignore everything else, and all you're focused on is, I want to learn the skills to study Talmud. That's my interest. That's my goal. What about ego? There's no ego. If a person doesn't have what to eat, and he has to go and assume a certain job, which normally would be disgraceful, but it's honorable because you prefer that over begging. But how do you do it? If my life's at stake or I have to support my families, there's nothing I won't do. But what about your honor? There's no issue of honor. All you see is, I have to live, my family has to live. That's all that's important. If you value knowledge to that degree, ego is not an issue. All I want to know is to know and to advance myself. So it's very interesting. This person, his uncle was a lawyer, and his uncle was not an observant man. He was the head of the SEC. Eventually, he worked for the government, and he worked for the SEC. Eventually, he became the top lawyer for the SEC, this person. He himself today is a man in his mid-80s, lives in Lakewood. He has great-grandchildren studying, and he's there with his wife, and he sits and he has this nachas. He has this so-called background, lawyer, head of the SEC, all these whatever acknowledgements, but because he had such a desire to know minimally how to understand and appreciate what was rightfully his, he left no stone unturned. He didn't let his ego interfere. And he succeeded. And now he's at a different place. So the reason why David says it, David's giving us good advice. Bikom lam de iskalti. So if King David, who, as I said, in one night, through prophecy, he was able to understand Torah, when it took 100 years on an ordinary level to understand, to study. If he could say, there's no one I can't learn from, Could you say there's no one you can't learn from? If he said there's a chance there's what to learn. So what's the difference between you and King David? He was mega miles ahead of you, light years ahead of you. So why could he and why can't you? You know what the answer is? Ego. That's the difference. Because David had humility, therefore he's not passing up an opportunity. If there's a chance, I'm going there. That's Mikom Lamde Iskalti. So again, we're talking about choice. Humility is part of everything's predestined, except righteous, devout, or evil. But what determines that? Why don't people see many things? Why do we make wrong choices? Although at a certain level we know they're not right. Why do we do our due diligence very often? We don't want to bother ourselves because it's okay. But that has to do, well, how could it be okay? Maybe it's not okay. That has to do with humility also. That has to do with humility. It is okay because I feel it's okay, but it may not be okay. It all goes back to humility. That's what it's all about. Shenemar. Tov erech apayim Gibor is interesting. A person who's erech apayim, he's tolerant. A person who's tolerant. A person who does not become angry. Erech apayim, he has a long fuse. That's erech apayim. Af is anger. Erech means he has a long fuse. He doesn't get ignited so quickly. He's better than a person who's powerful. We're talking physical strength. Umosha berucho, and a person who controls his spirit. He dominates the spirit. Mlochadir, a person who could conquer a city. You may physically conquer a city. Now, what did Rome? Rome was the height of power for 500 years. Rome ultimately fell. What did they fall over? What? It was all debauchery. They became perverted. They did things which are unconscionable. But eventually, it totally disintegrated. But why? They made mistakes. But why? What drove them to behave that way? It was the animal. They're brilliant. But the brilliance drove the animal. It was an intellectual animal. That's how he took over the world. But you understand? But a person who controls his spirit is more powerful than a person who conquers a city. You may have conquered the world, but that's only temporarily, because ultimately you're going to make that mistake because you have no control over your behavior. And if you have no control of behavior, ultimately the mistake is going to be a mistake which is going to bring it all down. So again, where are we going back to? The Maral Prague writes, we spoke about anger. What is the basis for anger? The basis for anger is ego. Why does a person become frustrated? Frustration brings anger. Why does frustration bring anger? Because if I am who I am and I perceive myself as being me, so why can't I deal with it? I can't deal with it. If somebody comes to you and says, I want you to figure out a formula which has to do with physics. The person says, something? The person wouldn't even attempt to try to figure it out. He has no background. So he says, you know what? I could maybe find somebody who could. I recommend somebody who has a background in physics. But myself, it's not my area. But it's something that you believe it is your area. And you attempt to figure it out, and you can't. Why did you attempt? Because you thought it was within your ability. So when you realize you can't, which you originally thought you could, you're disappointed with yourself. That's a setback in terms of your own self-perception of who you are. Therefore, it causes a degree of frustration. If the person's smart, he says, I realize this is out of my pay grade. It's not within my pay grade. Another person says he works on it, invests time, and he still doesn't figure it out. Then he gets frustrated. Because why did he invest so much time? Because he believed he could figure it out. So now it's a reflection on him that he fell short of what he believed he could be. Doesn't reflect well on him. When something doesn't reflect well, what do? You get upset. And that's anger. I told you to do something. Why didn't you listen? The person gets angry. If I told you to do it, that means you're supposed to listen. So it all goes back to ego. Everything in life is ego. I choose to do the wrong thing. Torah says, you're not permitted to eat that species, but I want to eat that species. I'm not talking about inadvertent, but I want to. But God says differently. Again, it's always the me and the I. That always becomes the overriding factor, and that always becomes the struggle. Is the I, or is the I you recognize, as much as I want to believe who I am, but ultimately God's will prevails. And he's the overriding factor in your life. And that's tzaddik, and that's the Russia. The Russia couldn't care less. And if you go down that route of the evil, you become desensitized that God at best is just a name, but has no relevance to your life. And there's always the I. And I keeps growing, expanding, magnifying, until it totally consumes your life. If you read the history, there was a book published of the 100 most wealthy families at the beginning or the end of the 19th century. And how many of those families are still wealthy? Maybe 2% or less. No, the cycle. People are poor, they become wealthy, the wealthy become poor. But very often, what happens? Person starts off at the bottom of the ladder, wants to go into the real estate business. And the man, his ego is not yet inflated. What does he know? And all of a sudden, he sees an opportunity, he buys it. And then all of a sudden, a real estate magnate, because he made a mistake and he overextended himself, the banks called the loans, couldn't pay, a fire sale. The banks took possession of properties. You heard about it. You were able to get it relatively for a steal. Your day is made. Your career is there. Now, the mistake that real estate mogul made, he shouldn't have made that mistake. Somebody else would have made that mistake. But as human beings, the more we succeed in our lives, we believe ultimately we become invincible. We don't make those kinds of mistakes. Like a person says, what I sense in a moment, you won't sense in a whole lifetime because of my experience. But part of that is ego. And if very often you miss certain points, and if you would have noticed it, it would have happened. So ultimately, what was the basis for the man's downfall? His ego. So why is the other person able to pick up the pieces? Because he doesn't have that ego. But ultimately, if you succeed long enough, ego is an inborn problem in every human being. And that ego, unless you control it and you temper it and you keep it in check, what happened to the last person is going to happen to you eventually. And that's the cycle. The cycle is always making those mistakes. But very often the mistake is because you didn't see what you should have seen, based on your background, your experience, and everything that goes along with that. There's a certain person, in the 80s, people had certain financial reverses. And I said to this person, what do you think it happened? He was still very wealthy. He said to me, because I think I was too arrogant. I made certain decisions, which I shouldn't have made. Certain purchases I made, I bought certain companies, which I shouldn't have. And of course, I did my due diligence, but I thought it would work out. But if I would have been more humble, I would have realized I should have stayed away. So I said, so what's your lesson? My lesson is to be more humble. And that's what he said to me. And again, it always goes back. Every mistake in life, mostly, is due to humility. When we speak about wealth, poor, strong, whatever's predestined, but the only thing which is not predestined is tzaddik Rasha. Tzaddik Rasha, what fuels that is to what degree are you in control of that, of your ego? That's what it is. You're in control, you have it in check, you have clarity. You don't have it in check, then you're blinded. You're blinded by temptation, you're blinded by power. You know, we say power corrupts. What does power corrupt? Because the person believes that because he was able to achieve something other people can't, that says he's somehow superior to others. Rather than seeing that he was gifted and God was good to him and he attributes it, it's not him, it's God. That's the only way you're able to maintain that ego. It's not me, it's him. Moshe Rabbeinu forewarns the Jewish people before they go into the promised land. In the desert, nobody could fool themselves. Every day you had your daily allocation of the manna, the water. Wealth meant nothing. Wealth only had value. They had tremendous wealth, which they had taken out of Egypt. They're wandering with it for 40 years. You can't eat gold and silver and everything else. But when you're going to go into that promised land, and each person is going to have his own vineyard and his own piece of property, and he's able to build his mansion there and go and get involved in transacting, negotiating financial deals, he says, you better be careful. Don't ever say, don't allow yourself to enter into that mindset that the power and my own acumen brought about all this success. If you ever said that, you know what the end is? Rom levavcha. Your heart will become swollen, and you're going to forget God. People say, no, thank God I didn't need God. This deal I did on my own. You know, some people, you know, thank God I was able to go to Harvard, this, and meet these people, this and that. You think that all came by itself, but people believe they are the makers of their own destiny. They are. But sometimes destiny, not success, failure. Because the failure is due to what? Not seeing it correctly. And usually it's ego driven. Ezo Oshir. These are such fundamental lessons of life. But again, you know, the Gemara tells us that envy is one of the worst characteristics. Why? Envy is a person, when you see another person having more than you have, it's like corrosive. It touches you in a way that you can't deal with it. Some people have a moment of envy. I wish I had what he had. And you have, but it's like a fleeting feeling. Other people who are truly envious, they see somebody having something that they don't have, and they would want that. They're pained by it. And you don't want to be associated around that kind of person who has that kind of eye on you. But that's envy. But a person who's totally riddled with envy, he has no moment's peace, because he's always pained and touched by something negative, because somebody's bound to have something more than you. It may be a peer, it may be somebody who you see within your reach. It's painful. Gemara says that a person who is envy and a person who is intolerant of other people, his life is not a life. You don't have a moment's peace. Wherever you turn, something is rattling you. That's envy. Now, how do you deal with envy? It's a bad one. You know, today maybe they have medication for envy. I'm not sure. You have to deaden the person's mind or something, put them into a stupor. I'm not sure. But we're talking about Ezo Osher. Who is a wealthy man? You're satisfied with your lot. Know what that is? It's not simple. People are not satisfied as much as they have. And if they have less, they're not satisfied, definitely not satisfied. And even when they have more, they're still not satisfied, because they still want more, because there's no end to having more. So if a person has to deal with this, right, how does he deal with this? The Mishnah tells us, Osher Samech V'Chelko. And it explains why, based on, again, a verse in Tehillim. Yigiap kapecho ki tochel. If you eat the labor of your handiwork, of your palms, ashrecha tov loch. You're fortunate, and it will be good for you. Meaning, if it's sufficient, my daily earnings, whatever it is, as little as it may be, and you eat it, eating means, and you're satisfied with that. You're satisfied with that. It is good for you. It is good for you, and it will be good for you. I mean, it's good for you, so of course it'll be good for you. What's the double? Ashrecha v'tov loch. Ashrecha v'l'mazer. You're fortunate in this world. You know, you keep your eye on the ball. I don't live up to the Joneses. I don't live beyond my means. I'm satisfied with what I have because I'm satisfied with my lot. So in this world, things are great. I have everything. I'm lacking nothing. Would I want more? Yes. But you know, life is pretty good without having more. Would more make it easier? The answer is yes. My predicament is, so life is difficult. Nobody said life has to be perfect. And that's a person makes do with whatever he has. That's Ezu Oshis. It's good in this world. The Tov L'Cholam Haba. A person's not satisfied. People resort to certain things which are illegal or criminal or border on the criminal, or that's lying or stealing or cheating, whatever it may be. So what drives all these unacceptable behavior patterns? Because you're not satisfied. Person's satisfied. So why should I even consider taking something which is not rightfully mine? I have no need. You have some people, many years ago, now today they have the Pierce organization, they distribute to the poor. But years ago, before Pesach, talking about in the 50s, most shuls, Horowitz, Margretton, Manischewitz, they would make up Pesach packages to give out to the poor because they themselves were distributors of many of the kosher products, whether it was wine, whether it was matzah, whether it was various things, even chicken. And they would go and a person would get a box and there are people around the corner waiting for the, and sometimes they'd have to wait hours, but that made the difference whether they were able, not they weren't necessarily observant, but they were traditional. They wanted to be traditionally involved in observing the Passover holiday. And there were people on this line, they would park the car around the block and they may have driven a Cadillac or an Oldsmobile, and they were also on the line. What are you doing on the line? Don't you have any sense? Don't you have any shame? Well, I parked it 3 blocks away. Nobody knows the difference. But why? You can afford it. Because if they're giving it away for nothing, why not take it? What kind of mindset is this? Why don't you focus on what's more important? Not if you can get it for nothing, take it. Take what? You can afford it. You prefer to take something and lower yourself and act and present yourself like a beggar or a needy person when you're not needy. What's the answer? What's the shame? Because when you're not satisfied, you don't see the forest from the trees. You don't see it. There's no shame. People are shameless because they don't see it, because all they see is they see themselves. So when you see every detail, if you're satisfied, you have no conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is driven because you're not satisfied. You want to see it the way you want to see it to justify that you shouldn't have any guilt. That's the conflict of interest. That's how it plays in. But if you're satisfied with what you have, so there's no reason why I shouldn't see it the way I should see it. So if I see it the way it should be seen, there's no justification unless it's truly justified. So this is such a key element in terms of being happy, being content, being tranquil, being focused, being satisfied with your lot. But let's say a person's not. What do you do? Person's envious. What do you do? Now, We're talking about a person who believes in God. You believe. And if you believe in God, you believe that you have a destiny, you have a purpose. And if you have a destiny and purpose, we understand we can't do it on our own, even as much as initiative. God has a say within that equation, whether you succeed or fail. Because even the person who believes he has something to do with his success, he says, of course, God could have prevented it from happening. Well, God definitely had something to do with it because he wanted me to succeed. So a person at least considers God's part of the equation to that degree. The person is able to come to understand he's a lot more than that. It's more than that. It says, Ezeu osher hasameach bechelko. You're satisfied with your lot. Chofetz Chaim writes, each person, his mission in life is very unique. Two people don't necessarily have the same mission in life. It can be on a personal level, it can be related to others. And God provides the means to be able to succeed in that mission. Because if he denies you those means, how are we supposed to succeed? I'll give you an example. We have, the Gemara tells us, this tzaddik v'tovlo, but tzaddik v'ralo. You have a tzaddik where things are outstanding in his life. He's endowed with intelligence, with good looks, with charisma, with energy, with good health, and with material means. You find such a tzaddik. Find another tzaddik, failing health, materially lacking. That's tzaddik v'ralo. Now, the tzaddik who's tovlo is God paying him off in this world for his good deeds. Or it's unrelated. Unrelated. Now, if you work for a company, remember there was a person years ago, he worked for Rothschild Bank. He was from Canada. He came from a very wealthy Canadian family. And he was single. And, he had a chauffeured limousine with a driver. He would stay every night in a hotel, $5,000 a night, because he actually had clients. He represented Rothschild, and he had a wardrobe, very expensive clothing, everything. Went to the fanciest restaurants. He wasn't observant at the time, and whatever. He told me afterward that he was sick of it. He just wanted to leave it. Couldn't care, the material, the lavishness of that, wasn't interested. Now, a person, but when he was on the expense account of the Rothschild Bank, did that have anything to do with his salary or with his bonus? The answer is no. Because if you're acting on behalf of the bank and you're doing business, and that's what it costs, that's the cost of business. It's unrelated to him personally. A person, his mission is to be able to be an influencer in Judaism. So he needs intelligence. He needs good health. He needs an attractive personality. Sometimes he needs means, material means. Of course, he has to impress upon certain people. Unless he has that amenity, he's not going to be able to impact on those people. So all that he's given, all these endowments, is part of his mission. Because every mission of every Jew or every human being is tailor-made for that particular person. It's based on the spiritual makeup of his soul. What exactly do you need to perfect your soul? What do you have to do? What do you have to bring about in this existence? What challenges do you have to deal with? That's tzaddik v'tovlo. Tzaddik v'ralo means this person, that's not his responsibility. He doesn't have to overturn the world. His challenge is, despite all the shortcomings that he has and all his levels of deprivation, despite that, he has an unbelievable love for God and he reveres God, fears God. And he speaks positive of God. That's his challenge. It's a different challenge, but that's his mission. If you realize that the portion you receive is tailor-made to address exactly what your mission is, then you're wealthy. You're satisfied, you're content. Because anything else would detract you and distract you from what you're supposed to be doing. Therefore, if you're samech, you say, thank God, as they say, lean and mean. That's what life's all about. Not to get distracted. So that's chelko. Even the person who's tzaddik v'tovlo, the additional wealth he has doesn't distract him because he understands the value of that extra he has because he's going to employ it where it has to be employed to bring about what he's all about, what it's meant to do. And therefore, this man has no reason to steal because life is not the material. Material is purely a means to an end. And if I understand I could come to that end without that degree of means, I'm happy. I could sit and study the rest of the day. I'd have to earn more. I don't need the more. I don't need that extra home. I don't need that extra amenity. I don't need my house refurbished every 3 years. I don't need it. It's not part of me. I don't host those kinds of people that every time they come, they have to see some kind of change to impress them. I don't need that. Because he understands his chelik, he understands his purpose. And if you see that and you internalize that reality, it's okay. Now, the story I was telling over with the Chofetz Chaim, this wealthy Jew was an observant Jew. In the early part of the 20th century, he came to visit the Chofetz Chaim in Radin. Radin was a little town, village, where the streets were not paved. And the Chofetz Chaim lived in something relatively what exists today to a hovel. It had a wooden floor, but rickety table, few boards banged together. He had his svarim, his books on it, but something which was not impressive whatsoever. And this Jew comes, he wanted to see the Chofetz Chaim, to receive a blessing. He walks in, he's like amazed. And he says to the Chofetz Chaim, he says, I'm amazed. I thought if I come into your home, you'd be living in a mansion, man of your status and your renown. You deserve it. That's something you should have. So he says to the wealthy Jew, he says, by the way, where are you staying? He says, I'm staying in the inn down the road. He says, could you describe me your room? He says, no problem. The rug is shredded, discolored. He says, what about the wash basin? Well, the handle's broken off. Its stand shakes. The curtains are discolored. One of the windows is missing. There's a rag that closes the window. He says, a man of your wealth should stay in such an inn. He says, Rabbi, you real? I'm just passing through. So Chofetz Chaim says, I'm also passing through. That's it. And that's what life is about. We're only passing through. So if you understand that, what do I need in this life to make sure when I leave this pass through, I arrive at my destination the way I'm supposed to arrive? That's what it's all about. So if you understand your chelko, that whatever God gives you, your stipend is in correspondence to exactly what your needs are. He doesn't want to give you to distract you, but you have to understand that. Most people, I always say this, there's certain schools that if you enroll the child, you want your child to go to Harvard or to Yale, you enroll your child in a certain preschool, and then he goes to elementary school, high school, and if he has this background, then he's a candidate for Harvard if he has the grades, or if the father has the money, one or the other. Then he goes there. Because his father has a law firm, and he would like his son to go into his law firm. But the question is, did the father ever ask his son if he wants to go into the law firm to be a lawyer? Never asked the son. Maybe it's not to his liking. So the father already has decided the life of their child because, what makes a person happy? Money. So if he's going to ultimately be a partner in the law firm, he has everything. But that's not what life's all about. Maybe he'll be miserable there. Maybe give the child a choice. I know better. Of course, at the beginning, you thought that's the responsibility of a parent. But it reaches a point in life, a person that may have certain abilities which we should apply to elsewhere, and that person will feel satisfied and content and successful in his life. Going elsewhere, he may succeed, but not on a personal level. Materially, he may succeed. But isn't life only money? Well, if it is, then it's a problem. That's why the son will be miserable. And the son has an ego issue, a self-esteem issue, because every decision was made for him. He had no right to make his own decision, how he should live his life. And even the type of family he marries, the father chooses that. Has to be a socialite, has to be a person of a certain means. And if he doesn't rate financially, he will disgrace our family. And you marry a woman that the man's never happy with her. She may be a showpiece, but she's not a person. And this repeats itself. But if you samech bechelko and you understand that that's not what life's all about, it's about who you are, not what people think you are, then we speak of being content. And if you are content, then you have it all. To be continued.
Thank you.
We have Daf Yomi at 11 o'clock.
11 a.m. Okay.
Yes.
See you later.